thank you everyone for attending online. And I'm very honored and very happy and pleased to introduce Professor Nigel Stork from Griffith University. That's where I got my PhD as well. He is a professor at, Emeritus Professor at Center for Planetary Health and Food Security at Griffith School of Environment and Science in Australia. And he is one of the profound ecologists for me, especially in relation to canopy science, given that I am now working primarily on canopy biodiversity and ecology. And he has already published over 200 papers with H10 index of more than 150 as far as I remember. So he's been really productive until I think even after his retirement. And just to read his short bio there, he's, as I said, that he is one of the profound ecologists, especially in relation to using insecticide to quantify the biodiversity in the canopy and to even get further into the canopy ecology. He pioneered one of the industrial canopy cranes. As you know, that we now have 3 canopy cranes across Yunnan, but he is one of the people who established and started this kind of canopy crane approach. And he's originally from the UK. He was working at Natural History Museum in London since 2018 until he moved to Australia in 1995. And he was in James Cook University until 2016, and I think he moved to Griffith University. And I remember that I met him in around 2000, I think, when I was doing my honors degree. And yeah, since then, we've been working together, and he's been a great mentor as well as a great scientist. So I'm without further ado, I'd like to welcome Nigel to this online webinar. And thank you very much, Nigel, for your time. And the line is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aki. It's a great pleasure to talk to you and to everybody. The subject I'm going to talk about, I have basically been giving lectures on this now for about 25 years. I've been interested in this subject for decades, but my ideas have changed over the time. And so what I'm going to do is to cover an outline. Whoops, here we go. I'm going to look at, first of all, how many eukaryote species have been named so far. And you'll see I view things from an entomological point of view. I look at the species richness of beetles, insects, and arthropods. And then I'm going to ask a question of where undescribed species are living. I'm going to talk a little bit about cryptic species. We hear a lot about DNA analysis. And then I'm going to talk about whether we are in a 6th mass extinction event. And as I said, I look at this from an entomological perspective. So why insects and why beetles? Well, Robert May, who I worked with in the past, he died a couple of years ago, he said, to the nearest approximation, all species are insects. In other words, the majority of species are insects, and therefore you need to be thinking about insects when you're talking about how many species there are. And then Haldane, who was a philosopher, was asked by someone what he could ascertain from the study of creation about what God's views were. And he said that God had an inordinate fondness for beetles. And the reason for this is a quarter of all described species on Earth so far are beetles. And of course, I've been working on beetles right since my PhD in the mid-70s, and particularly when I worked at the Natural History Museum and since then. And here, this is the Natural History Museum, which I joined in 1980. And up on the top right, you can see a picture of a species of beetle that I named and described from Tanzania, amongst a number of others that I looked at. But working in this collection, you've really started to understand the massive diversity of insects on Earth. So the first thing I'm going to tackle is just how many eukaryote species have been named so far. I don't look at prokaryotes, viruses and bacteria and so on, much more complex and more difficult to equate to the single cell multicellular eukaryote species. Well, the catalogue of life has so far inventoried 1.8 million species. And an estimate is that the full inventory will be about 2.2 million. But don't forget, some of those are accidentally named more than once. So about 20% of those are synonyms, we think. And so there could be roughly about 1.5 million really named species. Then if you start to look at the distribution of those of the insect orders, you can see that there are really 4 or 5 orders which dominate the diversity. There's about 1 million species of insects described. And the largest group, of course, is the beetles. And then you have the Lepidoptera, moths and butterflies, Diptera, Hymenoptera, and Hemiptera. And then all the other 20-odd orders of insects really make up only a small slice of the pie. Now I'm going to start talking about the different ways of estimating global species richness of beetles, insects, and arthropods. But I put this picture up here, which was drawn for Quentin Wheeler, where he'd actually got, in this you can see that the size of the organism is supposed to represent the numbers of species roughly for that particular group. So you have a massive beetle representing the insects there, and a large mite underground, and then mollusks you can see there as well. And fungi, a nice slice for fungi as well. But the elephant represents the vertebrates and so on. So this gives you an idea of what we should really be thinking about in the world about the diversity of life. Well, the first real, I'd say, global estimate for species richness was by Kirby and Spence way back in 1826. Don't forget, people had been describing species for about 40-something years then. So massive interest at that time in insects and other organisms. And they suggested that they thought there were about 110,000 to 120,000 plants and fungi on Earth. Now in Britain, they thought there was a ratio of about 6 insect species for each plant species. So that's the first time someone had used this ratio of the diversity of insect species to plant species. And so they said they thought that there would be about 600,000 insect species globally. Now, for the rest of, much of the rest of the talk, I'm going to be summarizing my views, which I presented in 2 major papers, one in 2015 with 3 other authors in PNAS, and then the next one is an annual review of entomology study in 2017, which I wrote on my own. Now, the 2015 paper was really a summary of what I thought were some new approaches where we might get a better estimate of how many species there are. Now, when I look at those, there are about 8 different methods that I summarized there. And I've highlighted in yellow the ones that I'm going to be talking about here as well. So host specificity is really the big one, if you like. And way back in 1980, 1981, I was one of those people who are using knockdown insecticides. This is the machine here. This is me in Indonesia and spraying up into the this insecticide fogging machine up into the canopy. And the background picture is of one of these insecticide fogging machines spewing out insecticide into a large Diptera tree in Borneo. Now, I just wanted to tell you that Borneo experience was my first attempt to work on knockdown insecticides and insects. And I had plastic sheets under 10 trees, about 20 square meters of plastic sheet under 10 different species of tree. And I fogged them And you could literally then hear the patter of insect rain as it fell down onto the plastic sheets. I brushed up the insects then into a bottle, and I had about a glass, something like, if you had a glass like that, that would effectively be the amount of insects that I collected from those 20 trees. Obviously, I put ethanol in and I took them back to the museum. I have to say, I was a little disappointed. I thought I would get a lot more insects. When I got back to the museum, I sorted them. I found I had about 25,000 insect specimens there, and my colleagues and I sorted them to species. There were about 5,000 species of insects, enormous diversity from just 10 trees. Well, at the same time I was doing this, a guy from a scientist from the Smithsonian in Washington was also doing this similar kind of work. Terry Owen, his name was. Unfortunately, he passed away a couple of years ago too, but he made some very valuable contributions. Now, what he did was to sample using knockdown insecticides from one species of tree in Panama. And cleverly, what he did was to fog 19 of those trees, and he did them across different seasons. So he did a very good job. He sorted all the beetles, roughly sorted them to about 1,200 species. And then he did a back of an envelope calculation, because someone asked him how many species he thought there might be on Earth. Well, he made a guess that about 169 of those 1,200 beetles would be specific to that particular tree. In other words, an average of about 13.5% host specificity. That's 169 compared to what Kirby and Spence said was 6 to each tree in the UK. Then he said that there are about 50,000 tree species or groups in the world. So they've all got the same number of host-specific beetles. That would give you 8 million beetle species. Now, he guessed that the beetles were about 40% of the canopy fauna, and so he added the others on to come up with 20 million. And then he guessed that the canopy is twice as rich as the ground fauna, and that will give you 30 million. Now, of those 12 million species of beetles, that's a massive increase in the diversity of beetles. Now, the interesting thing, what he's done here is he's set up really an agenda of research for other scientists, because a lot of these things we couldn't answer. So a number of us that over the next 30 odd years have attempted to try and get new data on some of those things, on host specificity, the ratio of the canopy to ground species, and the proportion that beetles make up of the canopy fauna. And I'm just going to give you one example here. When I set my crane up in North Queensland, I set up Malaise traps just like this, 5 pairs of them, one on the ground and one in the canopy. Now this one is collecting insects as they hit the net and drop into those trays below, as well as going into the Malaise trap bottom. And here you can see one up in the canopy, and I had pairs on the ground. And I set up 5 pairs of these and sampled for 4 years. Of course, this is the crane that we were using to help get those Malaise traps established in the canopy. So here we are, 5 pairs of Malaise traps and 5 paired flight intercept traps, monthly samples for 4 years. And in the end, I had 1,500 species of beetles. When I looked at these and I used some statistics to assess this, I found that 25% of those species were canopy specialists and 25% were ground specialists. 50% were shared between those two strata. In other words, they weren't specialists at all. So in other words, I think Terry Owen had got that bit wrong. There wasn't just that they were either ground specialists or canopy specialists. The interesting thing is that 25% was clear right from the first year of sampling. And as I added more samples to it, it didn't change it at all. So here we had some new data to test Terry Owen's ideas. Now, a very clever fellow called Andrew Hamilton, who I worked with, a number of us here worked with, decided what we could use statistical analysis, quantifying uncertainty, to assess all this new data to test Terry Irwin's ideas, using exactly his theory, but providing better information on those different parts of the equation. And this is the probability distribution of all those different estimates that we produced. And so it gives you this hump distribution with a long right-hand tail. And the dotted lines coming down are the 95% confidence intervals. Now, in fact, what we had was two mean estimates here. As you can see, we've got data here on host specificity, the ratio of canopy to ground, the ratio of beetles to other arthropods. And that gives you an arthropod species richness of 6.1 million or 7.8 million, depending on some of the assumptions you make. Now, the interesting thing was that Terry Irwin's estimate of 30 million is where that number 3 is on the graph. In other words, it's way outside the confidence intervals. And so it really has no credibility at all. So when people say 30 million species, there might be 30 million species, they just haven't really looked at the new data. And I think this shows it quite well. Now, the other thing is when we did this gave, or if I used it just to measure beetle species richness, it said 1.5 to 1.9 million species, way below the 12 million beetle species that Terry Irwin was suggesting. So a second idea of looking at this is looking at ratios of known to unknown. In other words, so you take a fauna like the British fauna, which is almost totally described, and you look at one particular group, which is particularly well described around the world, and look at the ratio of that group in the Britain to the total number of species against those worldwide species. So here we've got butterflies, which are 67 species in the UK compared to 26,000 of arthropods in Britain. Worldwide, there are 17,500 species of butterflies. So that ratio means that you roughly got 6.8 million species of arthropods, which is strikingly similar to the previous estimates I just showed you. Now, the second one is looks at the ratio of beetles to plants. It's a little bit like the host specificity, but it's not meaning, it doesn't say that there's specific, it's just the ratio of the numbers of insects compared to the numbers of plants, and could be any group of insects at all. Now, Joppa and others did some modeling to suggest that they actually estimated what proportion of the world's plant species are yet to be described. It's only a few %, but it means that they could come up with a total for all of the plants in the world, and particularly different plants, the numbers of different plants or percentages of the world's plants in different regions. They suggested 2.1% of the world's plants are found in North America, and the beetle fauna list for North America is just over 25,000, with a projected total of about 28,000. So using that ratio, it would suggest that with this method, that there's 1.2 to 1.3 million beetle species. So we're coming up with another method, new data. Now, perhaps the most novel method that we use, which had nothing to do with any of these host specificity or plant ratios or whatever, was looking at the body size and year of distribution, which I first published in PNAS. Now, again, looking at the British beetles, this is the cumulative total of British beetle species over time. And the latest checklist is about 4,069 species. And you can see in the last 100 years, there's only been about 100 or 100 plus species added. So it's been almost fully described for quite a long time. But one interesting thing was noted by a former postdoc at the Natural History Museum who was working while I was there, was that he plotted the body size and the year of description for those British beetles. And he noted that the average body size of beetles was going down over time. In other words, the larger species have been described first, and it tends to be the smaller species that wouldn't be being described later on. Very interesting observation. So this got me thinking about what we could do with that idea. And the Natural History Museum's insect collection is really rather remarkable. It's about half of all the described species on Earth. And it's regionally very representative. In other words, there's not a large gap in the collection for South America or Africa. It's pretty comprehensive. And it's also comprehensive across the groups of beetles as well. Here we are. So that it's about 12,000 draws, over 8,000 million specimens, and 180,000 named species. Remarkable. So I thought we could use this body size of British beetles to estimate global species richness. So we assume that the British beetle fauna is fully known, and it's representative beetle fauna worldwide. And secondly, we don't think I don't think it's an impoverished fauna. It's representative taxonomically. It's not any major group that's missing, and it's representative in terms of body size. And we assume that the Natural History Museum beetle collection is also biased towards the larger species being named first. So what I did with my wife one summer was to go to the museum, and we took every 40th draw in the Natural History Museum beetle collection. So we examined 189 beetle draws. We wrote down the species name of the beetles and measured the body size of them. A total of 2,500 beetles were measured. So this is another graph of the British beetles showing you how the cumulative, the mean body size goes down over time. So just a slightly different way of looking at it. But on the graph, what I've done is to plot what the mean, the 95% confidence intervals are for the samples, the beetles that I measured from the Natural History Museum collection. And these mean body sizes, the either ends of those confidence intervals, are the same as the British beetles between 17 that have been described from Britain in 1758 and 1760, when 350 to 437 species are described. In other words, 1/10 of the British total. So there we take the ratio of the beetles in the Natural History Museum to the numbers of British species described in those 2 years. We can use those as multiplication factors. So here we are, 179,000 over 352. That's a multiplication factor of 510 or 411. Then multiply to convert the number of British species to a global estimate. And this gives you a figure of 1.7 to 2.1 million species of beetles. Again, you can see how close these are to some of the previous beetle estimates as well. So I'm just going to summarize for some of those different methods then, what we've got here in terms of the estimated number of species of beetles in millions and the estimated numbers of species of terrestrial arthropods in millions. And you can see that they are strikingly similar for each type. And so that we come up with a mean estimate of 1.5 million beetles or 6.8 million terrestrial arthropods. And I can do the same for the insects as well. I think that's in the next slide here. So here we go. This is these are the ranges then you've got for beetles, 1.5 million, and insects 5.5, and terrestrial arthropods 7 million. So why should we believe these? We think we should believe these because these are mean estimates based on averaging 3 to 4 estimates from credible independent methods. And it suggests that we are closer to estimating global species richness for insects and arthropods than we previously thought. Now, just there were a couple other methods that I mentioned. I thought taxonomists' estimates or guesstimates is a rather clever one. Kevin Gaston, this is back in about 1990, asked a range of taxonomists how many species were described for their particular group and how many species they thought existed, including the undescribed ones. Most of them thought that about 5 times as many to be described for their group. And Gaston concluded that probably 5 million species of insects on Earth. Now, this really is quite remarkable because it ties in so well with those previous estimates that I've made. And also, it suggests that taxonomists have a pretty good grasp of what there might well be for their groups. So, in this particular table, I've asked where are the undescribed species. Again, I've used that paper by Joppa, where he's actually suggested what percentage of the species are distributed around the world. And then I've taken those figures that I've got for the numbers of arthropod species and insect species and beetle species and divided them up evenly between these regions. And you can see, if you look the tropics, and about close to 1 million in Africa, and not far off, 750,000 in the Indo-Malayan region as well. So this gives a bit of a guide, I think, for people trying to estimate just how many species there might be in their particular region. And it should be possible to work out then what proportion of the species have already been described and how much more work they have to do. 2 things that jump out at this. First of all, 85% of those species are tropical species. Now, I certainly in the past, I used to see people say that 2/3 of species were tropical, 1/3 were temperate, but they're often talking about vertebrates. Here, I think this is quite conclusive that the vast majority of insect species are in the tropics. Now, the second thing, which I haven't put any data down here, but according to Kevin Gaston's work on rarity, most species are rare and have narrow ranges. And that has implications in terms of their likelihood of extinction, which I'll be talking about soon. So cryptic species, now a lot of people have really looking at data from the DNA barcoding and discovering a lot of cryptic species. And here's a really interesting paper by Dan Jansen and colleagues in Molecular Ecology Resources, where they took samples of Lepidoptera, Braconidae, and Tachinidae, and looked at the numbers of species they thought were there, and then after barcoding, and massive increase in the numbers of species detected by barcoding. So, but I think you have to be very careful about how you interpret this, because a group like the Lepidoptera, which are pretty well known, the percentage increase was only 9.1%. But for the Braconids and the Tachinids, it was a massive increase. You have to conclude it's not that there are more cryptic species there, it's just that the taxonomic work previously was really rather insufficient. And therefore, you're only discovering them by barcoding, but if they put the normal taxonomic effort in using other methods, they would have probably found these numbers of species as well. So you have to be very careful when people suggest that cryptic species, that more effort with cryptic species will reveal many, many more species. I am not convinced of that. And to test this, I looked at, there's a couple of studies I looked at where people had taken whole faunas, well-known faunas, in this case, the German beetle fauna, a massive study where they looked at close to 16,000 individuals of 3,500 species of beetles, about half of the German beetle fauna, and most of the beetle families. And they found that 92% were unambiguously single species. They found that 6.8% had more than one barcode identification number. In other words, there's potentially two species there. 2.6% shared bins barcode identification numbers. In other words, they were probably the same species. So an overall increase they found of 2.2% species. So when you take a large fauna like this, that's been very well studied, massive amount of taxonomic work over many years, you see that there aren't that many cryptic species. It's just detecting a few, and probably most people might have been able to say, I think there's something going on with this particular species or this group because of the variability they found. The second one is looking at DNA studies of birds. And here, again, this is an American study representing 93% of the fauna, the bird fauna of USA and Canada. Again, 94% of species had distinct barcode clusters, and 6% corresponded to small sets of closely related species, a lot of which hybridized regularly, and 2% currently recognized species comprised of 2 distinct barcode clusters. So here again, it's just showing you that the standard taxonomic work that's been done over using a range of other methods have already revealed most of the species, and the DNA barcoding work is really showing you where there are some complexes, and often people know those complexes are there. So my summary for global species richness, I get about 6.8 million species of arthropods, 5 million species of insects, 1.5 million species of beetles. Most species have small distributions and are rare. I've here jumped ahead and I've suggested that really if you take all the other eukaryotes, there's about 8 million species altogether. And studies by Mora and others, very nice studies, I think I come up with very similar figures to this. But we really don't know for small groups such as fungi and nematodes, and a lot more work is needed. Interestingly, about 80% of species of those 8 million are terrestrial and only 20% marine. DNA studies may change this, but I don't think dramatically. Certainly not for the insects, but it could be for groups like nematodes and fungi. I don't know. So I'm going to move into the area of extinction now and what we can really say about extinction. And again, I just want to repeat, I look at this from a point of view of diversity of insects. I'm not working on birds, I'm not working on mammals. The wonderful man, Norman Myers, who revealed so many extraordinary things, suggested way back in 1993 that Earth's biodiversity is being overtaken by a mass extinction, which could well eliminate between 1/4 and half of all species. So let me just talk about what is a mass extinction event. And this is, I've summarized this from a paper by Robert May, John Lawton, and myself in 1995 in this book. And mass extinction events will occur when 75% of species are lost of that particular group at one time. But we have to know that there are more species now than there have ever been in spite of those mass extinction events in the past. And so 96% of extinctions, we estimated, have occurred outside those major mass extinction events. In other words, extinctions occur all the time. It's not something that's just in those mass extinction events, and you need to bear that in mind. So one of the big things that people have used to look at extinction events is the species area relationship. And this is because the larger the area of a particular an island, say, as you double the size, as you increase the size, I think by 10 times, you double the numbers of species on it. And way back in the 1980s, Norman Myers and a group of others were suggesting that we were losing large areas of forests, tropical forests, and therefore using species area relationships, we will be losing a lot of species. And this is a summary table I put in a paper way back, I think 1993, showing the estimates. These are decadal estimates from some of these authors here. Norman Myers, Tom Lovejoy, the Ehrlichs, Ariel Lugo, and E.O. Wilson. And these are suggesting very high percentages of loss of global species per decade. And they were suggesting this on the basis of the species area relationship, which we know is not particularly accurate. So let me just go on to how many extinctions have actually occurred since the year 1600. Now, each year, the IUCN expert panels examine the status of around 35 to 40,000 species of animals. I think it's probably much more than that now. And there have been recorded since the year 1600 about 1,500 animal and plant extinctions. One estimate, it's very hard to find estimates for current extinction rates, but I think one credible one is by Lindemeyer and Bergman of about 0.25 to 0.5% per decade. Now, this is from a figure from the Global Biodiversity Assessment back in 1995. And this is where the extinct birds came from since the year 1600. And you can see virtually all of these species that went extinct were on the islands. In fact, if you look at the islands in the Pacific region, we know that there's probably 1,500 to 2,000 species of flightless rails that went extinct when the Melanesians moved onto those islands as well. So if you took the year of extinction back to maybe 1,000 years ago, you could probably include those. And all it would do is just boost those figures on the islands here. We are seeing a shift of more species extinctions to the large land masses, but I have to say, it's still not a very big shift. Just wanted to mention this one thing, that extinction is really quite rare for organisms, but this is an example. The passenger pigeon was one of the commonest birds in North America, and it was basically hunted to extinction. But they actually have lice that are specific to them, or most animals and birds have lice which tend to be quite specific. And when this bird went extinct, we thought that 2 species of host-specific lice also went extinct. And I think these are the first documented case of co-extinction. However, we've now since found out that one of those bird lice was a misidentification, and the other is still found on bird species. Again, just proving to the point that extinction is quite difficult. Now, what can we say then about the rates of extinction in insects and invertebrates? Well, I think there was a nice study done a few years ago by a group in Paris Museum, and where they actually looked at mollusks, pulmonate land snails, and they took a random sample of about 200 species, and they asked experts to say whether these were extinct or not. Don't forget what I suggested about taxonomists and their expertise in terms of estimating how many species there might be. And they found that 4.5% were on the red list already, 30% have not been seen since description, and 39% have not been seen for 50 years. They did some extinction probability modeling for each species as well by comparing the dates of collection with overall snail sampling effort. I'm not going to go into the actual stats they used, but both methods suggested that around 7% of described land snails are extinct. Now, I think there's great similarities with the insects and with the terrestrial land snails. My suggestion is we should probably think there's about 7% of insects that have also gone extinct as well. So I just want to summarize insect declines now. So in the recent years, there's been a growing body of empirical data showing that many populations of insects are declining rapidly. across many parts of the biosphere. Now, most of those studies are based in well-known temperate regions where there is phenomenal data, historical data for these. And what people have found is that the major drivers are habitat loss, habitat conversion, climate change, and a range of other drivers as well. So, but the point is, we don't know if there are similar trends for tropical insects. That really is uncertain. And I'm working with Roger Kitching, with Louise Ashton and her team from the University of Hong Kong on a grant where we're actually starting to make some assessment for tropical insects in different parts of the world. So I'm just opening that door, and you'll be able to watch for that in the coming years. Now, a few years ago, Mark Costello and I and Robert May wanted to test a few ideas that were going around to do with the numbers of species. And there are three concepts that we wanted to try and debunk. First of all, that taxonomists are declining in number, that there could be 30 to 100 million species on Earth, and that we don't even know to the nearest order of magnitude, and that we're in the midst of an extinction crisis. Well, it turns out when you actually look at the data, there are 2 to 3 times as many taxonomists now as there were in the 1960s. They're just not distributed in the same places. They're no longer necessarily in the major museums, the old museums, but they're spread across many other institutions now. And as I've shown, it's fairly convincing now that there are something like 5 plus or 3 million species on Earth. And also that there have been fewer extinctions than many people think. So we put up this graph here. And what I wanted to show here is what I think is a catastrophic state. And that is that the gray line is the gradual increase in the number of species that is described. Now, I think for about the last 40, 50 years, it's been an average of about 16,000 species per year. I don't think it's necessarily changed. I'd like to think it has, but so that is the rate at which we might describe species, the gray line. And then if we look at 3 possible extinction rates that are going on of 0.1% per year, per decade, 1% a decade, or 5%, you can see whether most species are likely to become extinct before they're described. If it's 5% per decade, then most certainly most species on Earth, particularly most insects, are likely to go extinct before they are named. So I want to highlight here something that I think is really quite appalling, and that is that there is not enough effort going on to increase the rate at which numbers of species are described. Many taxonomists are doing a fabulous job, but what we need is massive investment into it, and for the recognition of taxonomic work as equally valuable as any of the other disciplines in the environment. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about other factors affecting the extinction or loss of species. This is some work of the institution that I was running, collaborative institution called the Rainforest Cooperative Research Center. And here's some modeling done by a guy called Dave Hilbert. And you can see that green, this is on the wet tropics of Australia. The green area is the cool rainforest. See how that's shrinking at 3.5 and 4.5 degrees. Now, there's a number of species which are endemic to those upland forests. They're cool adapted species. This is a lemuroid ringtail possum, quite a common animal up in the tablelands. But with 1 degree of warming, it should be down to half of its distribution. And with 3.5 degrees, it should have disappeared. So we are seeing that the species with increasing warming, a lot of the upland species will not necessarily have anywhere to move up to. Then we've got the problem of the global biodiversity hotspots in the world, which are defined as areas where have 70% land clearing and at least 1,500 endemic species. There's about 35 of these now. One assessment of this by Yance and colleagues looked at the impact future climate policy could have on habitat loss in those biodiversity hotspots for the year 2100. The estimated potential extinctions due to future land loss and changes under alternative climate change scenarios. They predicted for the year 2100 a 26 to 58% reduction in natural vegetation cover in those hotspots, and additional up to 16% extinctions of organisms. Well, this was reanalyzed here by Jan Habel and myself and others. We actually looked at the percentage of natural intact vegetation remaining hotspots, and for most of them, it's really low. Then we remodeled agroeconomic pressure, including demographic pressure and income development. And we modeled for the year 2050, in other words, 50 years earlier. And we could see that modeling suggested that all that remaining natural intact vegetation would go because of the agroeconomic pressure and much greater loss of endemic species. We found that habitat loss remains that most pressing driver. Climate change was less important there than we believed. So let me do a summary then for extinction rates. First of all, species area relationships overestimate the rate of extinction, but not the endpoint. Extinction debt of biodiversity in tropical forests may be very large, but how quickly that debt, those species that are destined to become extinct, will really vary across taxa and across places. The relaxation times will vary. So in other words, we could do things to improve the situation. Extinctions are changing from islands to continental areas, and possibly the extinction debt is now being paid in those continental areas. There are really few recorded extinctions, relatively speaking, given the large numbers of species that are on Earth. But levels, as I said, I think could be up to 7% for invertebrates. Are we experiencing extinction rates of 10% more decade? I don't think so. No, it's more likely 1 or 2 to 2%, but it could increase. Are we in a sixth mass extinction event? I don't think so. Maybe for vertebrates, but certainly not for most organisms. But we could see mass extinction well before the end of this century. Habitat loss is still the main driver of biodiversity loss, but climate change will become increasingly an important driver and will work synergistically with habitat loss. Finally, species declines impacts ecosystems function and results in ecosystem collapse. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nigel. Thank you so much for a really nice, inspirational talk. Question time. Do you have any questions, online people? If you are too shy to speak out, you can write in the chat. But if you want to speak out, you can go ahead anytime you like, but please mention your name and your affiliation before you start your question.
Yes. Okay, could I have a question?
Yes, yes. Chen, please.
Thanks, Professor, for your extremely interesting and informative talk. I have two rather general questions. The first question related to the independence or the identity of the insect species. So as we understand the different taxonomic group, the experts may use different morphological traits to determine species.
Yes.
But meanwhile, so in terms of the biological species, which means those morphological species, how much match to the biological species concept? So you think what's a major mechanism or how many percent of those morphological species could be biological species? That's the first question. The second question is we are discuss a lot about the species extinction. Actually, it's quite difficult to give a very how to say robust, very accurate estimate. But for plants, for example, for tree species, based on previous different kind of estimation, probably in the past maybe 200 or 300 years, the planet should have around 30,000 tree species go to extinct. But a recent investigation demonstrates only about 160 species.
Yeah.
So this big gap, what that mean? Is that our previous estimate, it's overestimate, or this is an exception for tree species because they have the sort of kind of behind extinction phenomena, or any other reason? What's your opinion? Thank you.
Two really good questions. The first thing is, I'm not going to go into biological species concepts. And as you say, it varies from group to group, which is why you can only talk about eukaryotes, where at least there's some agreement between people, but not all. But you can't do it for prokaryotes at all. So that is a very rubbery answer to it. But I think you can get bogged down, if you like, too much in that detail in terms of the species concept. There are much better people than me that will talk about what the real species concept is. The second question, I think is a very good example of extinction debt. In other words, if you're suggesting that 30,000 tree species should be extinct, then there's an extinction debt of 30,000 species. It's yet they haven't reached that point. And in other words, they've declined to a sufficient level, but for some of them, that they're not actually breeding anymore. Dan Jansen called them the living dead. They can live for another 300 years, but they're not going to produce any more offspring. So I think that extinction debt is a crucial thing. There was a lot of debate a few years ago about the species area estimate. Some very nice work was done on it, and a lot of debate about it. But the important thing was the endpoint is still the same. Species will go extinct. It's just how quickly, because areas will only take a certain number of species. Some will hang on, but eventually they're going to become extinct.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question online here. I mean, in the message from Yang Hong, Integrative Conservation. She says, has the extinction rate of insects decreased or increased? Do you have any suggestions on how to encourage governments to invest in insect taxonomy work, particularly for monitoring purposes related to the global biodiversity framework, such as GBIF?
Look, this year, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. I tell you what, the main reason I'm thinking about this is I have a very large collection of 2,000 species of beetles from the wet tropics in Australia. It's a phenomenal collection. One group I've just looked at, I've had a taxonomist specialist on bark beetles working with me. And we've gone from 50 named species there to 110. In other words, more than half of those species are undescribed. Now, as far as I can see, no collection in Australia can take my collection. Their collections are full. So the emphasis on new taxonomy and on describing species has gone. There are still people doing it, but not many people. And I think this is an issue across much of the developed world where the emphasis on taxonomy has gone. And I don't think that taxonomists are recognized in the same way as ecologists. If you look at the Academy of Sciences in Japan, how many of those are taxonomists and how many are ecologists or evolutionary biologists? And I think I could say the same in America or in the Royal Society or in Australia. It is no longer valued in the way that it should be, because to get to that level of expertise, be able to sit down to do a major revision of a large group of, say, 200 or 300 species in a particular group, it takes 40, 50 years of expertise. One of the rare people who was doing this was E.O. Wilson, who was a brilliant ant taxonomist at the same time as being an evolutionary biologist. So it's something I'm very concerned about. First of all, we are not getting increases, necessarily a big increase in the rate of description of species. There isn't the interest from governments. They don't care. And globally as well, or organizations. And we don't have the facilities to house all those new species. I would say 80% of insect species are undescribed. Can you imagine building another museum 4 or 5 times larger than the Natural History Museum in London to house the insects that need to be described? No, I can't see it happening.
Okay. Another question from Xian Zhao. I don't know his affiliation, maybe from XTBG, I think. He says, do you think more surveys and monitoring programs should be established for discovering new species, or should we just collect data that can be used for I cannot read, for that can be used for, sorry, it's hidden. It said something. Can someone read for me something specific conservation management or answering particular research questions, considering the cost of biodiversity surveys? Sorry, I just cannot read.
Yeah, I understand. I know what you're trying to say.
Sorry. Yeah. He's from QT.
I feel that the way that people go about establishing insect collections is, and have done over years, is that they collect vast numbers of common species, many individuals of them. I know that in the Natural History Museum in London, the butterfly collection there, I think, is 3 or 4 times the size of the entire rest of the collection. And you're only talking 17,000 species of butterflies in the world, right? Massively oversampled. Now, I can understand sampling those things is good if you're going to then use it for assessing environmental change or whatever you like, that kind of thing. But if you're going to be really wanting to make attempts to increase our knowledge about those species which are yet to be described and yet to be found, we have to change the way in which we collect specimens. We have to diversify our sampling, and we have to be much more specific to work on those groups of organisms that are really rather poorly known. There are whole ranges of, there's 150 families of beetles. Now I can tell you most effort goes on three or four families of beetles. The rest are largely ignored.
Okay. Any other questions? Online people?
Hey, I have a question.
Yes, Benjamin. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Benjamin Blanchard from XTBG, a postdoc in Aki's lab. Thanks for their talk and research. I did miss like the very first 10 minutes. So if this was discussed or answered in that time, then sorry, you can just say so. So my question is actually kind of just about whether or not the current extinction rate would qualify as a mass extinction event. And as I understand it, previous mass extinction events occurred over hundreds of thousands to millions of years. Like the Ordovician mass extinction being over a period of 1.4 million years. And so what I'm wondering is even if the kind of lower rate of 1 to 2% per decade is correct, wouldn't this still like kind of very solidly still qualify as mass extinction event, likely way out exceeding the speciation rate?
Yeah, look, I didn't talk about it in the first 10 minutes. You didn't miss anything.
Okay.
But I'm just trying to, what I did talk about, obviously, extinction. And I rushed through a lot of these things. There's so much to cover. But yes, you're right. Those mass extinction events didn't happen over one summer. They happened over very long periods of time. Some of them may have been much quicker, but we don't know. But at the moment, we are not yet. I think we're at the beginning of a mass extinction event, but we are heading towards it. There's no doubt about that. The way we are going, and particularly with climate change and with people not really grasping the issue of habitat loss. Some, those biodiversity hotspots that I talked about, the 35 of them, some of them are really very close to having almost total destruction. So it's not going to take much to really tip those over the edge. The only thing that stops some of the bits of untouched forest there from being cleared for agriculture is that the land's too steep or too inaccessible. But people will find a way if they want to. So, and those areas are the ones which are really harboring a lot of the endemic species in those places.
I see. Okay. Thanks.
Other questions? I have a question actually. I if no one's, yeah, okay. Nigel, thank you for your talk. I think you mentioned that most of the declines in insect biodiversity is recorded from North America, Europe, those temperate regions, and then there's hardly any information available from tropical regions in terms of long-term monitoring data. So we really don't know what's happening in tropical areas. And then there are some arguments from tropical ecologists that insect decline may not be really happening in the tropical areas because the cause of insect declines in those North America and Europe is the use of pesticide and also habitat loss, of course. Do you think that the rate of decline in insect diversity in the tropical area is similar to what's happening or what's been happening in temperate regions such as North America and Europe?
I can't really answer that. Apart from anything, you can't just lump all of the tropical areas together. There's different things going on in different parts of the world, different pressures. And the other thing is that a lot of things that are happening are acting synergistically. So it's not just one thing, it's a lot of things combined. And I think that synergy is really going to be critical, those synergistic things, because I think we're going to see acceleration. My expectations is that, yes, in a lot of the tropical forest areas, we are seeing increased extinction rates, increased species, or increased declines. But you have to pull out what's going on in different areas. It's not all going to be the same thing. It could be the defaunation in some of those areas of critical birds and mammals because of human hunting. So there's a whole range of things that are going on there, as well as climate change and the land use change as well.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? I'm actually tempted to ask one more question if there's no one else. I have two more questions, but I'll leave it to one more. You mentioned that that there's I remember that there's a publication from Rainforest CRC about 20 years ago that you showed in one of the slides that one of the mountain possums distribution is shrinking just by 1 degree centigrade increase resulting from climate change. But that was predicted 20 years ago. Do you think that really happened? Because I think the temperature increased enough over the 20 years or so. I just was wondering whether there was any studies conducted after that prediction, and to see if, because that publication was really daunting in a way, that the habitat is decreasing and the local extinction is really happening in the near future. Has anyone done resurvey to see if what really happened or happening?
I'm pretty sure people have. And I suspect the answer is quite complicated. I don't think it's very simple, but there was one species which is a frog that's only found on top of one of the mountains, Mount Thornton's Peak, right? They were suggesting 0.5 degree and that species would go. Now that's literally got a couple of populations there. But the interesting thing is that species, when it's not breeding, the adults are found underneath huge boulders. They live in a buffered environment. So they are buffered from the hot temperatures outside. When they breed, they can breed in the temperatures that are probably going to be suitable. And so that model, I think, would have not taken into account with these buffered environments. You remember also, Aki, from that work that was doing, Jeff Monteith was sampling things like errated bugs and ground beetles living in the soil and the moss layer. Errated bugs live under bark, and so the prediction would be that those species will go extinct, but they live in buffered environments. In other words, they're already used to these oscillations in temperature. That's how they can survive. So some of those predictions have to take into account how well the species is able to buffer its environment. And particularly with insects, you've got different life stages, and different life stages will be varying in their susceptibility to insect species loss. So I think it's a complex question, but I agree with you. I suspect some of those models are a little bit simplistic, and I'm sure they've got new data. Steve Williams will have got new data on that in the last month.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. Just to compare like what's happening for the larger vertebrates to smaller, tough little buggers like insects.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.